Rain slicked the pavement outside the onyx room, turning the neon signs into blurry, bleeding streaks of gold and violet. Dante Russo wasn't the kind of man to notice a stray cat, let alone a sobbing woman huddled by the dumpsters. He managed an empire built on extortion and enforced silence. But the sharp, ragged intake of her breath, hitching over the muffled bass thumping from inside his club, stopped him dead. He recognized that sound. It was the sound of someone's world breaking. The side door of the onyx room slammed shut, cutting off the heavy synthetic beat of the club's sound system. Out here in the alley, it was just the hiss of tires on wet asphalt from the distant avenue and the steady, freezing drizzle of a November night. Dante tugged the collar of his wool coat up against the wind. He was tired, a deep, bone-scraping exhaustion that came from smiling at politicians who despised him and threatening men who wanted him dead. "Cars out front, boss," Sal mumbled, shivering as he lit a cigarette. The flame briefly illuminated the scarred expanse of the bodyguard's face. Dante didn't answer. His attention had snagged on a shadow wedged in the narrow gap between the brick wall and the rustic commercial dumpster. At first he thought it was a pile of discarded coats. Then the pile shuddered. "Leave it, Dante." Sal's tone was flat. "Junkie, probably, or a drunk. Club security will sweep her out in 10 minutes. Dante took a step forward. His leather shoes made a soft splashing sound in the shallow puddles. He didn't know why he moved. Empathy was a liability in his line of work, a weakness that men with guns and ambition would carve out of you with a dull knife. But there was something about the rhythm of the crying. It wasn't the loud, performative wailing of a drunk who wanted attention. It was suppressed, desperate, the kind of crying done by someone who was terrified of being heard. He stopped 3 feet away. She had her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around them in a tight, protective knot. She was wearing a gray wool coat soaked through, the fabric clinging to her shivering frame. Her hair, a tangled mess of damp dark strands, was plastered against her cheeks. "Hey," Dante said. His voice was a low rumble, gravelly from too many cigars and not enough sleep. The woman flinched violently. She threw her hands up over her face, shrinking back until her shoulders slammed against the wet brick. She didn't scream. She just cowered, waiting for a blow. That flinch did something to Dante's chest. It was a visceral reaction, a sudden tightening of the muscles in his jaw. He had seen fear before. He manufactured it for a living. But the pure, anticipatory terror radiating from this woman felt different. It felt like a trespass on something innocent. Slowly, deliberately, Dante reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded linen handkerchief. He held it out. She peered through the gaps in her trembling fingers. Her eyes were swollen, the capillaries burst and red, staring at his outstretched hand as if it held a live grenade. The street lamp caught the side of her face. A dark, angry, purpling bruise was already blooming along her cheekbone, stark against her pale, freezing skin. Her lip was split, a thin line of dried rust running down to her chin. "Take it," Dante said, keeping his tone perfectly even. "No pity. You're bleeding." She hesitated, her chest heaving with stuttering breaths. Slowly, her hand crept out. Her knuckles were scraped raw. She snatched the handkerchief and pressed it against her mouth, shrinking back against the wall. "Sal," Dante said, not taking his eyes off her. "Bring the car around to the alley. We aren't going out front." Sal paused, his heavy boots grinding on the gravel. "You sure about that? We got the sit-down with the Kilbride crew tomorrow. You really want to pick up a stray tonight?" "The car, Sal." It wasn't a request. Sal grunted, flicked his cigarette into a puddle, and walked away. Dante crouched down, ignoring the dirty water seeping into the knees of his tailored trousers. He stayed at a distance, giving her the illusion of space. "I'm not going to touch you," he said. "But you're going to freeze to death out here. My office is inside. It's warm. Nobody goes in there without my say-so. She stared at him, the handkerchief still pressed to her mouth. Her gaze darted from his expensive coat to his face, taking in the sharp angles, the dark, unreadable eyes. She was weighing the monster she knew against the monster she didn't. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was cracked, barely more than a breath of air. "Because," Dante said, cynicism bleeding through, "I hate a mess in my alley." "Now, are you going to stand up, or do I have to call security to drag you out?" It was a harsh thing to say, but it worked. The blunt command snapped her out of her shock. She blinked, her jaw setting in a fragile line of defiance. Leaning against the dumpster, she forced herself up. Her legs wobbled. Dante didn't offer his hand. He knew she wouldn't take it. He just turned and pushed the heavy metal door to the club open, waiting for her to step out of the rain. The base was a physical entity inside the building, rattling the concrete walls. Dante led her away from the main floor, down a carpeted hallway bathed in dim amber light. The noise faded with every heavy, soundproofed door they passed until they reached the back wing. He keyed a code into a panel. The oak door clicked open. His office was a stark contrast to the neon excess of the club outside. It was quiet, masculine, and expensive, dark walnut, leather armchairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that actually held books. A heavy crystal decanter sat on a side table next to a silver ice bucket. Dante walked straight to the thermostat and cranked it up. Then he went to the small ensuite bathroom, grabbed a thick heated towel off the rack, and walked back out. She was standing exactly where he had left her, just inside the doorway, dripping onto his Persian rug, her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the room with the wide, vacant eyes of someone waiting for the trap to spring. Dante tossed the towel. It landed over her head. "Dry off. Then sit down." He walked to the drinks cart. He didn't offer her alcohol, shock and whiskey were a bad mix. He poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, the amber liquid glinting in the low light. Then he grabbed a bottle of sparkling water, cracked the seal, and set it on the glass coffee table in front of the leather sofa. He took a seat behind his massive desk, putting distance between them, and took a slow sip of the scotch. The burn grounded him. She pulled the towel off her head, wiping the freezing rainwater from her face. She looked awful. The harsh lighting of the office showed the true extent of the damage. The bruise on her cheek was shaped like a knuckle. The collar of her blouse, visible beneath the coat, was torn. She walked over to the sofa, her movements stiff, and sat on the very edge of the cushion. She picked up the water bottle and drank, her hands shaking so badly the glass clinked against her teeth. "What's your name?" Dante asked. He leaned back in his chair, watching her. She swallowed hard. "Vivian." "A beat. Vivian Marsh." Dante didn't smile. "Who did this to you, Vivian?" She froze. The bottle halted halfway to her mouth. She looked down at her knees, her wet hair falling forward to hide her face. "It was a mugging. A guy in an alley a few blocks away wanted my bag. I fought back. It was stupid. It was a lie. It was a bad lie." Dante had spent 20 years reading the tales of liars, the shift in posture, the avoidance of eye contact, the rehearsed cadence of the words. But more than that, a mugger didn't leave a woman in this specific kind of psychological ruin. A mugger took the bag and ran. This was personal. This was someone who wanted to leave a mark. Dante set his glass down. The solid thunk echoed in the quiet room. "I'm not a cop, Vivian," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I don't care about police reports or due process. But I do care about people lying in my office. A mugger hits you once and grabs the bag." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "He doesn't grab you by the collar. He doesn't hold you against a wall. The bruising on your neck, the finger marks, those say somebody wanted you to look at him while he hit you. So I'll ask again. Who?" A tear spilled over her lower lash line, cutting a clean track through the dirt and ruined makeup on her cheek. She scrubbed at it angrily with the back of her hand. "You don't understand," she whispered. "He knows people. Dangerous people. If I go to the police," he said, "he'd burn down my sister's house. With her kids inside." "I know dangerous people too," Dante said mildly. "Not like him." Vivian's voice shook. The dam was breaking, the adrenaline that had kept her moving crashing, leaving only raw panic. "He does whatever he wants. Nobody stops him. The police, the judges, they all look the other way because of who his family is." Dante went very still. In this city, there were only a handful of families that commanded that kind of absolute, terrified compliance. And Dante did business with all of them. "Give me the name." She squeezed her eyes shut, as if the syllables themselves would summon the devil. "Ronan," she breathed out. "Ronan Kilbride." Dante didn't flinch, but the air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. Ronan Kilbride, the golden boy of the Kilbride Syndicate, the untouchable heir to the docks. Ronan was a rabid dog wrapped in an expensive suit, a man who beat women, extorted local businesses, and caused endless headaches for everyone. But he was also the nephew of Fintan Kilbride, the man Dante had spent the last 2 years negotiating a fragile, highly profitable peace treaty with. "How do you know Ronan?" Dante asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Vivian opened her eyes. She saw the shift in him, the sudden detachment, and misread it. She thought he was scared. She thought he was backing off. "I ran a flower stall inside the arcade at the Regency," she said, her voice deadening. "He came in every week. He asked me out. I said no. I kept saying no. Then the property manager told me my lease was being terminated," said a VIP tenant had complained. "Tonight, when I was closing up, he was waiting by the loading dock." She swallowed heavily, her throat working. "He told me the whole block belonged to him. He told me I belonged to him. When I tried to walk past, he dragged me into the alley." She didn't need to finish the story. The bruised cheek, the torn collar, the absolute devastation in her posture painted the rest of the picture. Dante stared at her. His mind, trained for decades in the brutal calculus of organized crime, immediately began running the numbers. Protecting this woman meant harboring the victim of a Kilbride. If Ronan found out she was here, he would demand her back purely out of spite. Refusing him meant insulting Fintan. Insulting Fintan meant breaking the treaty. Breaking the treaty meant a turf war. A turf war meant lost revenue, dead men on the streets, and federal agents sniffing around his legitimate fronts. The logical, cynical choice was simple. Give her cash, put her in a cab to the airport, tell her to disappear. It was the smart play. It was the play his father would have made. It was the play Sal would expect him to make. He looked at Vivian. She was staring at her hands, the knuckles still bleeding sluggishly onto his towel. She wasn't asking him to save her. She expected nothing. The world had just taught her a brutal lesson about power, and she had accepted her place at the bottom of the food chain. That resignation twisted something ugly and violent deep in Dante's gut. He remembered the sound of her crying by the dumpster, the sheer, suffocating helplessness of it. He had built his empire so he would never have to feel that kind of helplessness again. But what good was power if you still had to tolerate the monsters in your own backyard? Dante stood up. The leather chair squeaked in the silence. Vivian flinched again, expecting him to throw her out. Instead, he walked to the corner of the room, opened a heavy cabinet, and pulled out a first aid kit. He brought it over to the coffee table and sat down next to her on the sofa, not too close, but close enough that he could smell the rain and fear on her. He opened the kit, pulled out a bottle of antiseptic in a cotton pad. "Give me your hand," he said quietly. Vivian blinked, confused. She looked at his hands, large, scarred, heavy with a single gold ring, and then hesitantly placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, but surprisingly gentle. He dabbed the antiseptic onto her torn knuckles. She hissed in pain, trying to pull back, but he held fast. "Ronan Kilbride is a dead man," Dante said. He said it so casually, so conversationally, that it took a second for the words to register in Vivian's brain. When they did, her eyes widened in absolute horror. "No," she gasped, trying to pull her hand away. "No, you can't. You don't know who he is." "I know exactly who he is," Dante interrupted, his voice a low, soothing rumble as he taped gauze over her knuckles. "I do business with his uncle. They run the ports. They're loud. They're messy. And they think the rules don't apply to them. Then you know you can't cross them," she said, her voice rising in panic. "If you do anything to him, they'll kill you, and they'll find me. Please, just let me leave. I'll take a bus out of state. Vivian." Dante's voice was sharp, demanding her attention. She stopped rambling. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the cold, dead calm in his dark eyes. It was a terrifying kind of stillness, the stillness of an apex predator that had just caught a scent. "I am Dante Russo," he said softly. Vivian sucked in a breath. The color, what little was left of it, drained entirely from her face. Even civilians who tried to ignore the criminal underbelly of the city knew the name Russo. They were the old blood, the quiet power, the ones who didn't make noise but made people disappear. "Ronan Kilbride thinks he owns this city because his uncle lets him play with the toys," Dante continued, moving to her other hand and repeating the cleaning process. "He beats up florists because he's a coward who mistakes cruelty for strength. But he doesn't own this city." He finished bandaging her second hand, closed the kit, and looked up, meeting her terrified, watery eyes. "I do." He stood up, walked over to his desk, and picked up the heavy black receiver of his landline. He dialed a 3-digit extension. "Sal," he said when the line clicked. "Call the captains. Tell them the sit-down with the Kilbrides is cancelled. We're locking down the clubs. And tell Marco to get a crew together." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sal knew exactly what those orders meant. "We going to war, Dante?" Dante looked across the room at Vivian. She was curled on his sofa, bruised, broken, and clutching a bloody towel. Yet she was the most real thing he had encountered in years. "Yeah, Sal," Dante said, his voice cold as the grave. "We're going to war. Find out where Ronan Kilbride is drinking tonight and tell Marco to bring the heavy equipment." He hung up the phone. The click echoed in the quiet office. The peace treaty was dead. His business was about to bleed money. The streets were going to catch fire. And for the first time in a decade, Dante Russo felt entirely, deeply alive. The armored SUV idled in the alley, its exhaust curling into the freezing rain like gray ghosts. The rear door was heavy, lined with ballistic steel, and closed with a vault-like thud that locked the noise of the city outside. Vivian sat huddled in the corner of the leather bench seat. She looked small, swallowed by the oversized coat and the encroaching reality of what she had just catalyzed. Dante sat opposite her. He didn't look at her, giving her the dignity of privacy as the adrenaline slowly seeped out of her system, leaving the raw, trembling exhaustion behind. He stared out the tinted window at the blurred street lights. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket, captains demanding clarification, lieutenants asking for targets, the machine of his family waking from a 2-year slumber, hungry and confused. He ignored them all. Sal was in the passenger seat, his massive shoulders tense, speaking into a burner phone in hushed, clipped sentences. "Where are we going?" Vivian asked. Her voice was thin, fragile, like old glass. "Somewhere quiet," Dante replied without turning his head. "My club is a fortress, but everybody knows where it is. If Fintan Kilbride wants to throw a tantrum when he hears what I'm about to do to his nephew, he'll send his boys there first." You aren't going to be there. You're putting yourself in danger for a stranger. Dante finally looked at her. The street lamps passing by cast rhythmic shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the cold intelligence in his eyes. I'm a businessman, Vivian. I don't do things for strangers. I do things for my own peace of mind, and Ronan Kilbride offended me. It was a lie, partially. It was a justification for the sudden, violent urge that had possessed him the moment he saw her cowering in the alley. But she didn't need to know that. She needed stability. She needed to believe that the monster sitting across from her was in complete control. The SUV navigated through the wet streets, leaving the neon-soaked downtown behind, pulling into the quiet, tree-lined streets of Harbor Heights. They stopped in front of a narrow 3-story townhouse wrapped in dark ivy. There were no lights on inside. Sal got out first, scanning the empty street, his hand resting casually inside his jacket. He gave a sharp nod. Dante opened the door and stepped out into the drizzle, holding his hand out for Vivian. She hesitated. The fear was still there, stamped into the lines around her mouth, but the alternative was the street, and Ronan. She placed her bruised hand in Dante's. His grip was warm and entirely steady. Inside, the townhouse smelled of cedar, old paper, and dust. It wasn't lived in. It was a safe house maintained for emergencies exactly like this. Dante hit a switch and soft lamps illuminated a tasteful, muted living room. Heavy curtains were already drawn tight across the windows. Sit, Dante instructed, pointing to a plush armchair. There's a doctor on his way. He works for me. He doesn't ask questions and he doesn't have a tongue to wag. He's just going to look at your ribs and that cheek. Vivian wrapped her arms around her waist, wincing as the movement pulled at her bruised torso. I don't need a doctor. I just need to sleep, or wake up. I don't even know what this is right now. You need a doctor, Dante said softly, but leaving no room for argument. And you need to trust me. The worst part of your night is over, Vivian. The worst part of Ronan's night hasn't even started. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of tap water, and brought it back to her. She took it with shaking hands. Will you? She stopped, swallowing hard. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and haunted. Will you kill him? Dante looked down at her. He didn't offer her a comforting lie. He didn't sugarcoat the brutality of the world she had just stumbled into. Not tonight, he said flatly. Killing him tonight starts a war I haven't fully positioned my pieces for. Tonight is about sending a message, a very loud, very permanent message. Fintan Kilbride needs to understand that his nephew crossed a line, and that the penalty is paid in flesh. He saw her flinch, and for a fraction of a second, regret flared in his chest. He was frightening her, but he needed her to understand the reality of the safety he was offering. A sharp knock at the front door broke the silence. Sal opened it, ushering in a small, balding man carrying a stuffed leather medical bag. Doc, Dante nodded. He turned back to Vivian. Let him do his job. There's a bedroom upstairs. First door on the right. Lock it if you want. Sal is stationed at the front door. Nobody gets past him. I'll be back before dawn. Where are you going? The question slipped out of her before she could stop it. A strange, desperate dependency had formed in the last hour. He was terrifying, but he was her terrifying monster right now. Dante adjusted the cuffs of his coat. To collect a debt. The Amber Room was a private, invitation-only cigar bar tucked into the basement of a high-end steakhouse. It was where the city's worst men went to drink expensive bourbon and pretend they were gentlemen. It was also Ronan Kilbride's favorite place to hold court on Thursday nights. At 1:15 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the Amber Room did not open for a member. They splintered inward under the force of a breaching ram. The music, a low, sultry jazz tune, screeched to a halt as the needle was ripped off the record by the bartender diving for the floor. 5 men walked in. They didn't wear masks. They wore tailored suits and carried suppressed automatic weapons. Marco, a man with the dead eyes of a shark and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, took point. The patrons, corrupt aldermen, union bosses, mid-level mobsters, froze. Panic is loud, but pure, unadulterated terror is entirely silent. No one screamed. No one reached for a weapon. They all recognized Marco, and they all knew whose leash he was on. In the back corner, sprawled on a velvet booth with 2 women and a bottle of vodka, was Ronan Kilbride. Ronan was 26, handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, with dark hair swept back from his forehead. He was currently staring at the men invading his sanctuary, his mouth slightly open, the arrogance slowly draining from his face as the reality of the situation bypassed his alcohol-soaked brain. The crowd parted as Dante walked through the shattered doorway. His footsteps were the only sound in the room, slow, measured. He didn't look at the politicians scrambling under tables. He didn't look at the bartender praying behind the mahogany counter. His dark eyes were locked entirely on Ronan. Ronan tried to stand, his bravado kicking in late. Russo. What the hell is this? You know whose place this is? You know who I am. Dante stopped at the edge of the booth. He looked at the 2 women pressing themselves into the leather upholstery, terrified, and gave them a brief, dismissive flick of his hand. They scrambled out of the booth and ran. Sit down, Ronan, Dante said. The quietness of his voice made the hair on the back of every patron's neck stand up. Ronan remained standing, though his knees were noticeably trembling. My uncle is going to hear about this. You're breaching the treaty, Dante. Over what? You want a bigger cut of the docks. You call a sit down. You don't kick in doors like a street thug. Dante didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He just moved. His hand shot out, grabbing Ronan by the throat. The younger man choked, his eyes bulging, as Dante slammed him backward onto the heavy glass table in the center of the booth. The table cracked underneath Ronan's weight. Bottles and glasses shattered, raining liquor and glass onto the floor. Marco and 2 other men instantly stepped forward, forming a wall between Dante and the rest of the room. A few of Ronan's bodyguards had finally found their courage and reached for their holsters. Touch the steel, Marco warned, his gun leveling at the chest of the closest guard, and I paint the wall with your lungs. Stand down. The guards slowly raised their hands, backing away. They were loyal to the Kilbride family, but nobody wanted to die for Ronan's stupidity in the basement bar. Dante leaned over Ronan, his grip still tight around the boy's throat. Ronan was thrashing, clawing at Dante's hand, his face turning a mottled purple. You talk too much, Dante murmured, leaning in so only Ronan could hear. He smelled of cheap cologne, expensive vodka, and sweat. You think this is about business? You think I care about your uncle's shipping containers? Dante released his throat, pinning Ronan to the broken table by his chest instead. Ronan gasped for air, coughing violently. What do you want? Ronan wheezed, the panic finally overriding his ego. A few hours ago, you were waiting at the Regency loading dock, Dante said. His voice was clinical, detached. You put your hands on a woman named Vivian. You dragged her into an alley. You hit her. Ronan's eyes darted frantically, confusion mingling with terror. The flower girl? You're doing this over some flower girl. Are you insane, Dante? It was nothing. Just a misunderstanding. She owed me respect. The absolute entitlement, the total lack of comprehension in Ronan's voice, solidified something cold and hard in Dante's chest. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt a mechanical necessity. Hold his right arm, Dante commanded. 2 of Dante's men stepped forward, grabbing Ronan's right arm and pinning it flat against the remaining unbroken section of the heavy glass table. Ronan started screaming now, a high, panicked sound. He thrashed like a netted fish, but the men holding him were immovable. Dante, wait, please. We can pay you. My uncle will give you whatever you want. Dante reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a heavy steel retractable baton. With a flick of his wrist, it extended with a sharp metallic clack. This isn't a negotiation, Ronan. This is a consequence. Dante raised the baton. He didn't swing wildly. He aimed with surgical precision. The steel cracked down on the back of Ronan's hand, the sound of shattering bone was distinct, a sickening crunch that echoed over Ronan's agonized shriek. The boy convulsed, his eyes rolling back in his head. Dante didn't stop. He raised the baton and brought it down again and again, methodical, brutal. He broke the hand that had bruised Vivian's face. He pulverized the knuckles that had left a mark on her skin. He did it until there was nothing left to fix, until the hand was a ruined, useless mess of flesh and splintered bone. Ronan passed out from the pain after the third strike, his head lolling to the side, spit bubbling at the corner of his mouth. Dante collapsed the baton and slid it back into his pocket. He looked down at the unconscious heir of the Kilbride Empire. There was no satisfaction in his chest, only the heavy, looming weight of what was coming next. He turned to face the terrified crowd in the lounge. "Tell Fintan Kilbride," Dante said, his voice carrying clearly across the dead, silent room, that his nephew forgot his manners. "If he has an issue with my teaching methods, he knows where to find me." He walked out of the lounge, his men falling in line behind him. The jazz record remained silent. The message had been delivered. The war had begun. The drive back to the townhouse was quiet. The rain had turned into a steady, freezing sleet, coating the windshield in a layer of slush. Dante sat in the back, staring at his hands. There was no blood on them, but they felt dirty. He had spent 10 years distancing himself from this kind of hands-on violence. He was the head of a shadow corporation now. He dealt in logistics, leverage, and quiet intimidation. The visceral, bone-crunching brutality was supposed to be behind him, a relic of his 20s, when he was fighting his way up from the streets. But tonight it had felt terrifyingly natural. The SUV pulled up to the ivy-covered townhouse. Sal didn't say a word as Dante got out. He just gave a grim nod. Sal knew the score. By tomorrow morning, the city would be holding its breath. By tomorrow night, the bullets would start flying. Dante unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The house was exactly as he had left it, quiet, dimly lit. Sal was sitting in the kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee, an assault rifle resting casually across his lap. "Doc left an hour ago," Sal said. 2 cracked ribs, a mild concussion, deep bruising. Left some painkillers. She's awake. Dante nodded, taking off his wet overcoat and draping it over a chair. He walked up the wooden stairs. They creaked softly under his weight. He paused outside the guest bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm yellow light spilled out onto the hallway floor. He pushed it open. Vivian was sitting on the edge of the large bed. She was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt the doctor must have found in one of the drawers. Her face was clean, the dirt and dried blood washed away, but it only made the dark, swollen bruising on her cheek and neck stand out more severely. She was holding a mug of tea, her bandaged hands curled tightly around the warm ceramic. She looked up when he entered. She didn't flinch this time. "You're back," she said softly. "I told you I would be." Dante stepped into the room, leaning against the door frame. He felt suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. "Did the doctor give you anything for the pain?" "Pills. They make me feel cloudy." "I don't want to feel cloudy right now." She set the mug down on the bedside table and looked at him, really studying him, searching for signs of a monster, blood on his clothes, madness in his eyes. But he just looked like a tired man in a very expensive suit. "What did you do?" The question hung in the quiet air, heavy and loaded. I am sure that Ronan Kilbride will never use his right hand to hit a woman again. Vivian sucked in a breath. She closed her eyes, a shudder running through her small frame. It wasn't fear, Dante realized. It was shock, the overwhelming realization that someone had actually stood up for her. In her world, the strong preyed on the weak, and the weak just endured. His uncle, she started, her voice trembling slightly, Fintan Kilbride, he won't let this go. No, he won't. He'll come after you. He will try. Dante pushed off the door frame and walked further into the room, stopping a few feet from the bed. My family has been in this city for 3 generations, Vivian. The Kilbrides run the ports, but we own the concrete. We own the politicians, the judges, the unions. Fintan is vicious, but he is emotional. I am not. He said it with such absolute certainty that Vivian almost believed him. But she had seen the way his jaw clenched, the subtle tension in his shoulders. Why me? She asked. The tears were back, welling up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. I'm nobody, Dante. I sold flowers out of a kiosk. I can't offer you anything. I can't pay you back. You risked your entire empire for a woman crying in an alley. It doesn't make sense. Dante looked at her, the bruised cheek, the cracked ribs, the utter despair in her eyes that was slowly being replaced by something else. A flicker of resilience. He walked over and sat on the edge of the mattress. The bed dipped under his weight. Vivian didn't pull away. When I was 14, Dante said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet rumble, a confession in the dark, my father caught a rival lieutenant skimming from our numbers racket. He didn't just kill him. He made me watch while he beat the man to death with a length of pipe in the basement. He told me it was a lesson in power. He told me the only way to survive in this world was to be the scariest thing in the room. Vivian watched him, captivated by the sudden vulnerability in the eyes of a mob boss. I learned the lesson, Dante continued, staring at the floorboards. I became the scariest thing in the room. I built walls. I cut out empathy because it's a liability. But tonight, when I heard you crying, I didn't hear weakness. I heard someone who had been crushed by the exact same kind of monster my father was. And I realized that having all this power means nothing if I let the monsters win in my own backyard. He looked up, meeting her eyes. The space between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. You don't owe me anything, Vivian. Not money, not loyalty. You aren't a pawn in this war. You're the reason I finally decided to start it. Vivian stared at him. The tears finally spilled over, tracking down her unbruised cheek. But she didn't sob. She reached out, her bandaged fingers trembling, and lightly touched the sleeve of his jacket. It was a microscopic gesture, a tiny bridge built over a chasm of trauma and violence. Thank you, she whispered. Dante looked at her hand on his sleeve. For the first time in years, he felt something fracture inside his chest, not breaking, just shifting. Get some sleep, he said softly, standing up. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. He walked to the door. Just as his hand touched the knob, Vivian's voice stopped him. Dante. He looked back. Will we survive this? Dante Russo looked at the woman who had just upended his entire universe. He thought of Fintan Kilbride assembling his killers in the dark. He thought of the blood that was going to paint the streets of his city. Yes, he lied. Beautifully. Perfectly. We will. The retaliation came at 6 a.m., right as the city's streetlights clicked off to welcome a bruised gray dawn. Dante was standing in the kitchen of the townhouse, staring into a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. His phone sat on the marble island, a silent black rectangle. He was waiting for it to ring. He knew Fintan Kilbride. The old Irishman didn't sleep on an insult. He was a creature of immediate, disproportionate violence. When the screen finally lit up, vibrating aggressively against the stone, Dante picked it up on the first ring. Yeah. It's Sal. His voice crackled through the speaker, the big man sounding out of breath, the background noise a chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting. They hit the diner on 9th. 2 cars pulled up, automatic weapons. Didn't even get out of the vehicles. Just sprayed the front window and kept driving. Dante's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. Who? Teddy. Sal's voice was grim. Took 2 in the chest. 3 of our guys are in the ICU. A waitress caught a stray to the shoulder. It's a mess. The cops are swarming. Teddy was one of Dante's oldest captains, a man who had bounced Dante on his knee 30 years ago. A man 3 months away from retiring to the coast. Dante closed his eyes. The calculus of war. He had initiated it, but the cost was always extracted from the people standing next to him. Lock down the territories, Sal. Nobody goes to their usual spots. Tell the street crews they're cleared hot. If they see a Kilbride car in our zip code, they don't wait for permission. He hung up. The kitchen was dead silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. He didn't hear her come down the stairs. Who died? Dante turned. Vivian was standing in the archway, wearing the same oversized gray sweatshirt. She looked pale, clutching the door frame for support, her ribs clearly protesting the movement. She had heard enough. A friend, Dante said. He didn't see the point in lying. A captain in my organization. Vivian's breath hitched. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes darting away from him, staring at the floorboards. Because of me. No, Dante corrected sharply. Because of Fintan Kilbride. Don't do that. Vivian looked up, and for the first time there was genuine anger cutting through her fear. Don't treat me like an idiot to spare my feelings. Ronan hurt me. You broke his hand. Now they killed your friend. This is my fault. If I had just taken the beating and gone home, your friend would be eating breakfast right now. She pushed off the door frame and turned toward the mudroom, where her ruined, damp coat was still hanging over a chair. What are you doing? Dante asked, taking a step toward her. I'm leaving. She grabbed the coat, her movements jerky and frantic. I'm going to the police. I'll confess to something. I'll tell them Ronan did it. I'll get into protective custody. I'll get out of your way. I can't let innocent people die because I was too weak to fight my own battles. Dante closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He grabbed the coat, pulling it out of her hands and tossing it onto the floor. You aren't going anywhere. You can't keep me here. She pushed at his chest, her hands bandaged and weak, her push barely registering against his solid frame. But she kept pushing, tears of raw frustration spilling over her bruised cheeks. I sold flowers out of a kiosk. I am collateral damage. Stop burning your life down for me. Dante caught her wrists. He didn't squeeze. He just held them firmly, stopping her frantic assault. He looked down into her tear-streaked face, his own expression entirely calm, an anchor in the middle of her panic. Listen to me, he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. Fintan Kilbride has been looking for an excuse to break our treaty for 6 months. He's bleeding cash on the docks and he wants my supply lines. If it wasn't you, it would have been a dispute over a truck route next week, or a rigged card game next month. You are the spark, Vivian. You are not the powder keg. She stopped struggling, her chest heaving, her eyes searching his for a lie. But your friend, she whispered, the guilt still choking her. Teddy knew the life he chose, Dante said, his voice hardening. But Fintan Kilbride made a tactical error today. He let his temper dictate his first move. He killed a beloved old man in a public place. He lost the moral high ground with the other families, and he brought the police down on his own head. He thinks he's fighting my father's war. He's not. Dante let go of her wrists. He reached up, his scarred thumb gently wiping a tear from her unbruised cheek. The touch was startlingly intimate, a stark contrast to the violence they were discussing. "You don't run," Dante told her softly. "Not from Ronan, not from Fintan, and not from me. You stay right here, and you let me finish what they started." Vivian looked at him, the exhausted, cynical woman warring with the part of her that desperately wanted to believe in safety. Slowly, she gave a microscopic nod. Dante stepped back. The softness vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating head of a criminal empire. "I have to leave. Keep the doors locked. Don't answer the phone. When I come back, this will be over." Dante didn't go to the streets. He didn't gather a dozen men with shotguns and drive to the Irish neighborhoods to shoot up pubs in a tit-for-tat bloodbath. That was how you lost a war. You lost a war by letting anger dictate your logistics. Instead, he went to a nondescript office building in the financial district. Sitting in a sterile, glass-walled conference room, Dante met with 3 men in expensive suits. They weren't soldiers. They were forensic accountants and maritime lawyers on his payroll. "Fintan Kilbride pays his enforcers in cash," Dante told them, staring at a map of the city's port spread across the table. "He generates that cash through Pier 9, untaxed electronics, stolen luxury cars, heavy narcotics. It all funnels through there before it hits the street. Pier 9 is locked down tight," Mr. Russo, the lead accountant said, adjusting his glasses. "Union guys loyal to Kilbride. You can't just walk in." "I don't want to walk in," Dante said. "I want to freeze it. The harbor master has a gambling problem. He owes the Deo family 200 grand. I bought his debt this morning." Dante pulled a folded document from his jacket and slid it across the glass table. "Call him. Tell him I'm calling the marker in. I want Pier 9 quarantined by the Coast Guard for a random, comprehensive hazardous materials inspection. I want every crate opened, catalogued, and stalled for a minimum of 72 hours. The lawyer blinked, realizing the magnitude of the move. "If the Coast Guard opens those crates, they'll find the contraband. Fintan's entire incoming shipment will be seized by the federal government. He'll lose $8 million in a single afternoon." "Exactly," Dante said flatly. "And when his soldiers realize he doesn't have the cash to make payroll on Friday, their loyalty to the Kilbride name will evaporate. You have 1 hour to make the call." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the news broke on the local channels. A massive federal raid at Pier 9. Fintan Kilbride's lifeblood had been severed with a phone call. No bullets, no bodies, just a systemic, catastrophic financial amputation. When Dante returned to the townhouse that evening, he was dead on his feet. The adrenaline had burned off, leaving a hollow ache in his bones. The house was quiet, filled with the rich, heavy scent of garlic, tomatoes, and simmering beef. He found Vivian in the kitchen. She was standing at the stove, stirring a large pot of marinara sauce. She had found a pair of sweatpants and a clean white t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She looked domesticated, out of place in a safe house, yet entirely grounded. She turned when she heard his heavy footsteps. She took one look at his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the brutal set of his jaw, and turned the burner off. "You look like hell," she said softly. "I feel like it." Dante took off his suit jacket, dropping it over a stool. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing a long, jagged scratch along his forearm where he had caught it on exposed rebar at a construction site earlier that day. Vivian walked over, pulling a clean dish towel from the counter. She wet it under the warm tap and stepped up to him. He didn't pull away. He let her take his arm. She wiped the dried blood away with slow, careful movements. Her bandaged fingers were clumsy, but her touch was incredibly light. "It's over," Dante said, breaking the silence. His voice was a rasp. "Or the worst of it is. Fintan is bleeding out financially. He'll call for a sit-down by tomorrow morning. Are you safe? She asked, keeping her eyes on his arm. I'm the one who makes other people unsafe, Vivian. She stopped wiping. She looked up, her gaze locking onto his. That's a line you feed your enemies to scare them. It doesn't work on me anymore. I asked if you were safe. Dante stared at her. He realized, with sudden, terrifying clarity, that she was right. The armor he wore for the world didn't fit when he was standing in front of her. She had seen him commit unspeakable violence. She knew exactly what he was. And yet she was standing here washing his arm, demanding he admit his own vulnerability. I will be after tomorrow, he finally conceded. Vivian let out a long breath. She stepped back, tossing the towel onto the counter. I made dinner. It's just pasta and sauce from jars I found in the pantry. It's not the Regency, but it's hot. They ate in silence at the small kitchen table. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the shared quiet of two people who had survived a car crash and were simply grateful to be sitting upright. Dante ate 2 massive bowls. It was the first real food he had consumed in 2 days. After dinner, Dante moved to the living room couch. He didn't want to go upstairs. He wanted to stay near the front door. He lay down fully clothed, kicking his shoes off, his gun resting on the floor within inches of his hand. He was asleep before his head fully settled into the cushion. Sometime in the middle of the night, he felt a weight settle over him. He cracked his eyes open just enough to see Vivian pulling a heavy quilt over his shoulders. She lingered for a second, her hand resting lightly on his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. Dante didn't move. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a decade, he slept without dreaming of blood. The text message came at 7 a.m. A burner number, a set of coordinates. Asterisk the old rail yard, North End, noon. Just you and your lieutenants, asterisk. Dante deleted the message. It was time. The rail yard was a graveyard of rusted boxcars and overgrown weeds on the edge of the city limits. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of old warehouses, carrying the bitter scent of industrial decay. Dante arrived in a 2-car convoy. He stepped out of the SUV, the freezing wind whipping the hem of his long black overcoat. Sal and Marco flanked him, carrying assault rifles openly. There was no need for concealment out here. Across the expanse of cracked concrete, Fintan Kilbride stood waiting. Fintan was a large man who had gone soft in his 50s, his face mapped with broken capillaries from a lifetime of whiskey. He was surrounded by a dozen armed men. They looked nervous, their eyes darting around the rail yard, waiting for an ambush. Standing slightly behind his uncle was Ronan. His right arm was encased in a thick white cast, suspended by a sling. He looked pale, gaunt, entirely stripped of the arrogant sneer he had worn at the Amber Room. He looked at Dante, and physical terror seized him. He took a step backward. Dante walked forward until he was 10 feet from Fintan. He didn't look at the guns pointed at him. He didn't look at Ronan. He looked at the old man. You broke the treaty, Dante, Fintan spat, his thick Irish brogue thickening with anger. Over a girl. You crippled my nephew. You cost me my best captain. And you tipped the feds off to my ports. You're a dead man walking. Teddy was a dead man, Dante corrected, his voice carrying effortlessly over the wind. You sent shooters to a public diner. You panicked, Fintan. And panic is bad for business. I'll burn your clubs to the ground. Fintan roared, a vein pulsing in his forehead. I've got 200 men ready to march on Harbor Heights. You think freezing one shipment stops me? Dante sighed. It was the tired sound of a man dealing with a slow child. He reached into his coat. A dozen guns instantly raised, the metallic clatter of safeties clicking off echoing in the yard. Sal and Marco didn't flinch. They kept their weapons leveled. Dante slowly pulled out a manila envelope. He tossed it onto the frozen concrete between them. "Pick it up," Dante said. Fintan glared at him, then nodded to one of his men. The soldier stepped forward, grabbed the envelope, and handed it to the boss. Fintan ripped it open. Inside were bank statements, offshore accounts, shell company ledgers, the entire financial architecture of the Kilbride syndicate, complete with account numbers and routing codes. Fintan's face drained of its florid color. He looked up at Dante, his mouth opening and closing in silent shock. "You don't have 200 men, Fintan," Dante said smoothly, "because you can't pay them. As of an hour ago, my people bypassed your digital security. Every cent you have hidden in the Caymans, in Zurich, in Panama, it's gone. Routed into blind trusts. Your empire is broke. You can't." Fintan stammered, the reality of his total ruin crashing down on him. "I just did." Dante took a single step forward, establishing absolute dominance. "You are obsolete, Fintan. Your men are already looking for new employers. By tonight, they'll realize you can't cover their bail or their paychecks, and they will abandon you." Dante finally shifted his gaze to Ronan. The boy flinched, trying to hide behind his uncle's bulk. "Here are the terms," Dante said, his voice cold and ringing with finality. "You retire today. You take whatever cash you have left, you take your nephew, and you get on a plane to Dublin. If I see Ronan's face in this city again, I won't just break his other hand. I will bury him under the foundation of my next casino. And you, Fintan, will hand over control of the ports to your lieutenant, Danny. Danny is a reasonable man. Danny understands that my supply trucks take priority." Fintan crushed the papers in his fist. He was a proud man, a violent man, but he wasn't suicidal. He looked around at his own men. They were looking at the papers in his hand, then looking at Dante. The shift in power was palpable. Loyalty in their world was rented, and Fintan's lease had just expired. "You're a snake, Russo," Fintan whispered, his voice cracking with defeat. "I'm a businessman," Dante replied. "And you're dismissed." Dante turned his back on a dozen armed men, the ultimate display of contempt and control, and walked back to his SUV. Sal and Marco backed up slowly, keeping their rifles raised until Dante was securely inside. As the convoy pulled away from the rail yard, Dante let out a long, slow breath. The tension bled out of his muscles. The war was over. He had won. He hadn't just protected his territory, he had absorbed his rival's infrastructure without firing a single shot of his own. But as he watched the gray city roll by his window, he wasn't thinking about the ports or the money or the fear he had instilled in the Kilbride crew. He was thinking about a pot of marinara sauce and a woman in an oversized sweatshirt. When the SUV pulled up to the townhouse, the sleet had finally stopped. A weak, anemic sun was trying to break through the cloud cover. Dante unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Vivian was sitting in the living room, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly at the wall. When she heard the door click, she stood up quickly. She searched his face, her breath catching in her throat, looking for bad news. Dante took off his coat and hung it on the hook. He walked over to her. He didn't stop a few feet away this time. He closed the distance entirely, stopping only when their chests were nearly touching. "Pack your things," Dante said quietly. Vivian's face fell. The fragile hope she had been harboring shattered. He had won, and now he was getting rid of her. She was a liability, a loose end. "Where am I going?" she asked, her voice cracking. "To my penthouse," Dante said. She blinked, confused. "What?" Dante reached up, his large, scarred hand gently cupping the side of her unbruised face. His thumb stroked her cheekbone. "Ronan is gone. Fintan is gone." Dante told her, his dark eyes boring into hers, completely open, stripped of the cynical armor. "You are entirely, irrevocably safe. You don't have to hide in a dusty townhouse anymore. You don't ever have to go back to selling flowers to men who don't see you. Vivian stared up at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't discarding her. He was claiming her, not as a possession, the way Ronan had tried to, but as a partner, as an equal, who had looked at the monster in the dark and hadn't run away. Your world is dangerous, Dante, she whispered, leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. It is, he agreed softly, lowering his head until his forehead rested against hers. But as long as I am breathing, Vivian, my world belongs to you. She smiled. It was a small, broken thing, but it was real. For the first time in her life, she wasn't standing in an alley waiting for the blow to fall. She was standing in the eye of a hurricane, held by a man who had ripped a city apart just to ensure she never had to cry in the rain again. Dante risked his entire empire and redrew the criminal map of the city, all to protect a woman who accidentally crashed into his life. Their story proves that sometimes the most brutal monsters are the only ones capable of providing true safety.